Prynhawn da, good afternoon everyone and welcome back to the Cymorth Cymru annual conference. I hope you've enjoyed today's sessions, really important discussions on workforce and how we support our workers to doing the incredible work that they do. And also such a stimulating and interesting presentation from the Museum of Homelessness about their activism and community work. We're finishing off with a really reflective session at this year's annual conference. We'll be reflecting on mindsets, culture and psychological safety with Charlotte Waite, who's now Senior Programme Manager at Nesta, but many of you will know her because she brings a wealth of experience from previous roles at Pobl, at the ACE Support Hub and Platform. She'll be reflecting on her experience of transformation and system change and how we can take a compassionate approach to public service innovation in Wales. Without further ado, I will introduce Charlotte Waite. Charlotte, please join us and deliver your presentation. Thank you.
Great to be here. Great to be back at Cymorth and great to be speaking to many of you who I know feel like kindred spirits. So today I'm going to talk about emergence and what that's meant for me, which is essentially what I've written there about sitting with chaos, feeling fear oftentimes, analysis paralysis, and how my conclusions are that evaluation needs to be our best friend, but perhaps not in the way that we know it now. I hope some of these reflections are helpful to those of you who are trying to implement new ways of working, trying to shift landscapes to continually improve things all of the time. Takes loads of energy, particularly given the context that we're working in now. And so I hope that some of my reflections and my learnings will help you with your own journeys. So the wake-up calls that I've had in my career that I'm apologies to those who've heard me rant on about these things many times. Lots of you will know that the first one is going to be the ACES research. So I'm not going to revisit that now, but this was the particular bit of the research that I think fired me up more than any other, which was this perception of people who'd experienced trauma and their perceptions of service supportiveness, and how if you had experienced ACEs, you can't see the bottom of that, it's not very helpful, but those different blocks there represent different services, so some of them are police services, some of them are social care, some of them, and you can see from the graph that those in red, so those people who've experienced more ACEs experienced feelings of feeling less supported by services than people who hadn't experienced adversity. So to me, this was like, well, once everybody knows this, we will completely change how we do services, because clearly the research is telling us that how we're doing services is not helpful to many people and the people who need it the most. And of course, we went around doing this with all of you doing it with us. So first of all, we raised awareness in Public Health Wales. Then we started making it happen with Cymorth's help, Welsh Government's help, and all of you mobilising and then spreading the skills, which I know is what's still happening. And that's the way our learning journey has gone. And then, of course, on reflection, we were coming up against the reasons why this wasn't happening. So the places where we were finding this more and more challenging, and the barriers were coming out, which is a great thing. It's never going to be a linear journey. So we knew that transformation was happening on individual levels. We were hearing different conversations, different language coming out. Organisationally, this was coming into the way organisations were structuring themselves. Everyone was getting the training. And at the network level, you know, organisations like Cymorth doing a fantastic job of weaving this change into the new narrative in the sector. But for me, the place where we're still at is this enabling environment, the environments that we create in our workplaces. And that's what essentially what today's work presentation is about, and essentially what my work is now about, is how do we create those enabling environments? Skilling up the workforce is a wonderful thing, changing the narrative around how we are helping and supporting people, changing structures within organisations, but it's how we keep those environments alive to be the right kind of dynamic ones to hold this stuff. And lots of you will know that this is where my learning took me, which was about the need to shift from very linear ways of looking at things. So the way I've just described, we tell people about it, we skill people up, and then it goes at scale. It's a very linear way of thinking about things, whereas actually systemically, we need to think systemically for these things to really hold, because fixing one thing in one place wasn't having an impact somewhere else. If things weren't commissioned differently, for example, or if leadership styles weren't changing, or if referral processes weren't changing, or if legislation was hampering us, we had to think about all of those things in the round, which is where we went next with the work. And again, it's a joy for me to go around and hear this shift very much alive. So interconnectedness is now weaved into all of our thinkings. We no longer have discrete services who don't feel like they belong to anything else. We all recognise interconnectedness, and more commissioning is moving in that way. I already talked about move from linear to circular, and so that need to circle back all of the time. So we are moving away from silo mentalities to much more emergent. So recognising that, the truth can't be imposed from the outside. The outcomes that need to happen here can't be imposed on a project from the outside, that often these things need to emerge in a very co-produced way from really listening to people and really levelling that ground between, those of us in service land and those of us not, so that a new solution emerges. The difference between seeing ourselves as part of a whole, I think, as we already talked about, in connectedness, and moving away from analysis of small outcomes for particular projects to synthesizing those against other things, and relationships being always key. And those of you who've been on PI training know that. So wake up call number one, ACE's research telling us that services are not helpful, and mobilising all of that thinking around systems change. Wake up call number two, of course, will have been spoken about today, is the storm we've all just experienced, only in very different boats, the pandemic. And of course, this was a very challenging time to be alive, but it was also a very inspiring time to be alive, because the desire for transformational change really noticed a difference in the rhetoric, and people really, you saw crisis theory sort of in action as big unresolved problems started to grow collective action around them. And so my hope, I suppose, is that as we all come back to normal and we're all sort of tired and battered, that we can work to create the right environments to nurture some of that movement that happened and some of that imagination. So imagination is going to be a real key theme for me today, because the stuff that we imagined that we made possible as activists during the pandemic perhaps is now being quashed again as we come back into our organisational ways of thinking about things. So this is that system shift in action. You all will have seen this tweet. It was like joy amongst a lot of the gloom, recognising that, the pathological understanding of mental health is no longer fit for purpose, that essentially we are reacting to our environments, and the roles that we all have to play in those environments can massively impact on people's well-being. And so that inevitably moves us away from a medical model. It inevitably moves us away from kind of linear ideas of support. There's something wrong with you, this support package will fix you, and off you'll go into your life. If we haven't looked at that in the round in the environment with which people are living, this is psychologically informed environments in a nutshell, that if we are creating that environment around people to thrive and for staff to thrive, then they will do well. So we can do hard things is a lesson. So the comfort zone is where, we turn up to work and we know what our job is and it's all easy and comfortable. What happened in the time of shifting us towards this transformational change was that we all entered our stretch zone, certainly during the pandemic and certainly during trying to shift many services to become more trauma informed, was that we all got excited. we all felt very alive and exhilarated and challenged, and things changed, and that's how change happens. And then I would say, this, are we on the line of that stretch zone now, is I suppose what I'm asking. Has our stretch zone been reached? Because are we now becoming stressed and tired and fearful and tense, and actually it feels like it's too big for us? And I certainly have felt that. I definitely felt that during the pandemic. And how do we come back from that then in a way that is, if we can't be continually radical and activist about things, can we actually create environments that nurture these ways of thinking in a much gentler and kinder, compassionate way to each other, but stay in our stretch zone? And I think we can. So it's time not to beat ourselves up. Like, sustaining systems change is just hard. And people will revert back, including me, back to the things that we know. We will go back to our comfort zones. We'll go back to our sofas and our pajamas, and I'll go back to my red wine on a Friday night when things get too much for me. We will just revert to type. That's what we do. But we have to understand that this is a huge barrier to change. And actually, for me, getting stuck in systems and even spending time identifying and imagining new ones, it is a reality for me that does not lead to impact. That won't necessarily change anything. It will just make us really good at understanding our situation better. It won't necessarily help us change anything. And recognizing this single loop learning. So we look at what we do. So we look at actions, processes, and techniques, and then we look at the outcome and outputs. And we learn from that, we reflect on that, the report tells us what works, and we might iterate. There might be a new funding round, there might be a new action, there might be a new service, and something else happens. We don't actually always check the reasons behind our actions, looking at our assumptions, beliefs, and social norms. So I think there's a deeper level conversation that we're not always having about what we're doing. I'll come to this back at the end about how I think evaluation should change and how we can change this. But it's about recognizing that often we are stuck in these loops that we think makes us reflective, and we think makes us able to affect change, but actually we're not doing that deeper level learning. So what I'm really talking about is mindsets, because how we feel about work, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about life, as you will have heard me say this many times, really is the only thing. If we are the system, if the system is broken and we are the system, we have to look at ourselves. We are actors in the system, and to look at ourselves, that means our whole selves. That doesn't just mean our work selves, our aspirational selves. It does mean all of us, the whole of us. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then it's us, the whole of us, that makes it the culture of our organisations. So it doesn't matter what your strategy is. It doesn't matter what fantastic trauma-informed training or strategies you've got. If your culture doesn't represent those values. And how do we understand culture? So Brené Brown talks about it being in the walls. It's the stuff that's in the walls. It's the stuff that is talked about as you're making the cup of tea. It's the jokes that people come to understand are funny in your kitchens. It's about the language that we use. It's about the stories that we tell. Are we telling stories about, how drunk we got on Friday night? Or are we telling stories about our children? It's about how we do our work. So what kinds of understanding do we have about what work is valued? Who gets rewarded? Do you get rewarded for overworking where you work, for example? Do you get rewarded for your tiredness? How well do we heal from injury? So, we talk all the time in trauma, understanding about rupture and repair. But actually, the rupture is fine. I hang on to this all the time with my teenage son. As long as we've got the repair, that's where the brain pathways are being healed and changing. So what about organisations that do that? How well do we have the skills to be able to heal from injury as an organisation? Do we have a practice of comforting each other? How comfortable are we with comforting? And I don't mean rescuing, I mean comforting. So that's very much about feelings, which I'll come on to in a second. And is risk taking talked about and rewarded? And do we question? I don't know why there's a comma there. So is it okay to question? And this comes to talk about psychological safety, as does risk, and our different understanding of risk and how we hold that for each other. And many, 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 many more things make up the culture of your organisation. So lots of ways in which you can assess this, and I'd be, happy to talk to you about that if you wanted some more. So how do we do this then? Oh, I'm sorry, that's a bit jumbled there. I don't know why that's happened. How do we shift mindsets and cultures to be able to hold transformational change? So how to be able to hold these kind of mindsets without the next revolution coming over and battering us all, pushed into crisis change? How do we hold these kinds of mindsets and cultures to enable this? So there's 4 things I think this will entail, and one of them is feeling more, which is the first one I'll go into. I talked about that. The other is psychological safety, which means essentially at its base level means that it's okay to fail, and failing requires vulnerability, so that it's okay to be vulnerable in your organisation, and it's only through failure, luckily, that innovation can happen. So actually, that's how you create innovative organisations, as if you've got psychological safety. It's all through leadership. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about that again. And it's also about evaluation. So how do we feel more? Well, luckily, we've just had loads of practice at this. I'm sure I'm not the only person to talk to you about this today. I'm just going to do a whistle-stop tour apologies, you all know this stuff. But just to get back into, so how are we going to help each other feel more? Well, we're going to use our neuroception. So we're not necessarily going to use our words. We're going to feel things. We're always feeling things all of the time. There is no mind-body disconnection necessarily. The mind and body are one. We could debate this, but your body is communicating to you all the time. And neuroceptions are responses to cues of danger and safety in every moment of your life, and they're happening inside the body, coming from outside the outside environment, and they're happening between people all the time. So I'd like you to just look for a moment at this image and sit quietly and just pay attention to not necessarily what thought is coming up for you, but where in your body you are feeling something as you look at this picture. And then this picture. Is anything coming up for you in any part of your body as you look at that picture? So I hope that wasn't too challenging, and you getting a sense of taking you back a short time, which I find those images very difficult to look at without feeling things in my stomach, because they really resonate with me about the distress that I was feeling during that time. And it was recognizing that during that time of my life that I was bombarded by signals of danger and disconnection all the time. And I was searching for signs of safety or connection, and in what was very unfamiliar territory around unpredictable events. So I can go back to that part of myself that was feeling those things, even though in my head I was allegedly holding it all together. But what's going on there? Well, you will all be familiar with this fight or flight. So, in normal Charlotte having a happy time at life, I'm down in this green zone where I'm curious and I'm open. So I'm mindful, I can be compassionate, I can be in the present, I can feel grounded. So I can do lots of great work in that place. I can be creative and work can happen. And then when I'm in this zone in the center here, I'm starting to feel panic and fear and anxiety. And so this can be a great place. You can become very mobilized in this place, back to where we started with this, of the great things that happened when people were feeling these things, and absolutely problems can be solved. And, we can get shit done when we're in this zone. Until, of course, it becomes too much and our nervous system is overloaded with these feelings. And then we might need to dissociate from that feeling and shut down. And we might need to leave work, stop work. I can't. This is really bad. before we come back down again. So there's the classic fight or flight. And let's go back a second. So at the top there, I'm regulated, I'm reaching out. So I'm thinking, this is fine, I can do this all online. At the centre there, I'm in my survival energy. Although I'm thinking I'm not trained to do this way, I don't think it's going to be very good, I can't get my job won. And I'm fighting with that resistance all of the time until I'm immobilised and I'm thinking, I'm a failure at this. This is all shit and nothing good is going to come of this. So although I'm safe in my home, I am not in any physical danger at this moment in time. Nobody is attacking me. I'm actually wired to look for cues of safety as much as I'm cued to look for cues of danger. And because there just aren't the cues of safety, my autonomic nervous system is being affected by that. And how do we manage this? So this is just an example. It's just an example of the pandemic. You can apply that to any moment of any life. And we are any moment have those three stories at each level going on within us. And we are telling ourselves a story from one of those at each level. So the story that we hear most strongly is generally the most active in our system. So tuning into your body and hearing those stories is a reminder for you of where you're at. And sharing that story with somebody else, or being able to connect with somebody else about where in your body that you're feeling things, and just having a curiosity about it, makes that feel much more manageable, makes us feel much more connected and much more held in those feelings, even though there may not be a solution to them in that moment. So it's about making space for curiosity and our stories. And so spaces for co-regulation, remembering that we're all inextricably linked. So even if you've got someone in your room, in your team meeting, who isn't saying very much, but actually they're feeling something in their body that is making them feel anxious, they're in their fight or flight mode, or they might even be disconnected, they will be projecting that into the room, and other people will be picking it up without them saying anything. And actually how the rest of the group behaves in that will help them regulate or not regulate how they feel. So some of this stuff can feel really uncomfortable. Those of you who know me know that I'm a massive fan of compassion circles, and that's one way of us to be able to co-regulate and bring this stuff out, get ourselves into our bodies in a very safe and compact way, but in a way that it enables some expression of the curiosity about these stories to each other. Not everybody finds these comfortable, but in my experience of doing them, even those people that are most uncomfortable with them feel something of the vulnerability of the group in those very short contained moments that enables them to relax and feel, actually, this is a safe space for being held in this moment. So remembering that we're always in this, the drive to survival and longing to connect. So actually, if it feels too unsafe for me to tell my manager that I don't think this is the right thing to do, or too unsafe for me to not laugh at this joke, that's my drive to survive and my longing to connect. So I will survive in this, and I want to connect to this group, even if that connection is unhealthy for me. I would need to survive in it. So it's understanding it and analysing our cultures and how we shift some of that to a more a space that enables innovation and transformation is by being able to feel each other. So remember, we're always on cue to each other, broadcasting to each other, I already said that, and we're sending cues of safety all the time. So when we receive cues of safety, it feels safe for us to regulate with each other. So then we come back into the green zone. So once we're in the green zone, this is where it's safe to be ourselves, and innovation and transformation can be held, because failure can be held, and movements from different ways of doing things can be held, and we're no longer needing to slide back into old behaviours, because actually we're feeling safely held there. Does this all sound familiar? So I just wanted to say that if you're already working in this way, in a really rigorous way, if you're really applying this stuff, then you will be very familiar with what I've said. And the feelings part of your work will be very alive in what you do. So the second thing I want to go on to here, so how we get into this mindset and culture that's right, is through psychological safety. and leadership. So let's go on to talk about that. So when when someone feels comfortable asking for help, sharing suggestions and challenging the status quo, you're more likely to be an innovative organisation. You're more likely to unlock the benefits of diversity because that is being paid attention to and valued, and you're more likely to be adaptive to change. You wouldn't think it'd be this simple, but it really is. So what do we mean by that? So a positive climate is the most important driver for psychological safety. So you need 3 leadership behaviours for that to be achieved: supportive, consultative, and then challenging. So, and team leaders, I'm sorry to say, there is an onus on you. And leadership in this sense doesn't just mean, the traditional hierarchy of leaders. It means leaders in all sense. You can lead in so many ways now that organisations are becoming much more open to this way of thinking about leadership. So actually you can have, someone with really good emotional intelligence leadership, someone who's doing your compassion circle leadership. There's different ways that leaders can hold this, but actually they have the strongest influence on the team's psychological safety. I already said that. So this part of consultative leadership. So it's back to co-production. How co-productive are you with your teams? So how much is everybody's views accounted for in how you make decisions? So I know from my own experience that can mean things take much longer, they're much harder, you much more negotiation, much more legwork, but actually it creates the right team environment that enables people to speak up, say when it's not right, and feel supported in doing that, which leads to the next thing. So that's the most direct effect on psychological safety. An indirect effect is supportive leadership. So that back to just demonstrating concern and support for team, not only as employees, but as individuals, crucially. So if you're cohering and compassionate, if you're taking the time to notice people, then you are more likely to have psychological safety, and you're more likely to nurture that in each other. And only then can you add challenge. So only then can you start to challenge your team members to stretch themselves, to move into their stretch zone or even beyond their stretch zone. And then you're more likely to get team players who are creative. Human leadership, so I've already said this, it's the same thing. So if you're able to have open dialogues, if you're able to talk about the disagreements in the team in an open and compassionate way, and you're able to co-regulate with those feelings, you're more likely to have innovative leaders. So dispersed leadership, that's not news to you, all of those things. And so your team then down the bottom is sense-making, you're building a much more resilient team, and you're able to respond to uncertainty. So why does this all feel so hard? If you're like, yeah, Charlotte, we know this, we know all this kind of leadership shits, yeah. Why is it all so hard to do? Well, we all, including me, have a very strong action bias. So we just want to get on with things. We just want to do it. I just want to do it, and I want to do it now, and I know what needs to happen, and can we all just do it, please? So, and Batman is a great guy. Who doesn't love Batman? So who doesn't want to be Batman, and who doesn't want to respond to the bat call? So just check yourselves, and ask your team to check each other. It was Einstein who said we should spend 55 minutes on the problem and 5 minutes on the solution. Whereas I sat in rooms just yesterday, probably spending 55 minutes on solutions and 5 minutes on the problem. We just want to jump there straight away all the time. And what happens then is you're not really listening and you're not really collaborating. Two of the things that are so crucial to innovation. The other thing that happens is we want to rescue. We often just want to sort stuff out ourselves. We want to rescue. We just need to be aware that and I know we know this, but actually by rescuing the situation, we are creating victims, and people don't often want to be rescued in the way that we think they do. I tell myself this all the time, the way I want to rescue my son from his GCSEs, and if I can only do his maths revision for him. And do we value rescuing is the other point. I also wanted to say about the exhaustion that creates. You actually become very tired as a leader if you are rescuing everybody all the time. I spoke to a leader just yesterday who was saying how, you know, they can't leave because they are the guardian of the values, and if they leave, then the values of the organisation might crumble because they are the guardian of them. Well, then there's a bit of work to do there about why does she feel that she is the guardian of the values, and how can that not be spread and by other people? Okay, and then there's this. So I think I've referred enough to this, but it's the point about open dialogue and psychological safety and being comfortable with those uncomfortable questions. So remember, Brené Brown, so not just me saying this, says that when we sever the heart, we kill courage. So, and recognizing that if you're not prepared to go there and have those more emotional feeling conversations and hold that difficult stuff for people, let them challenge you, let them express their discomfort with the culture of your team or your organization, then you're severing trust. And if you're severing trust, you're severing innovation and accountability. So does your organization value, where are you on this spectrum, this kind of oversharing culture or this stoics culture of just getting on with it? And or are you pushing your difficult conversations to HR, and is it creating processes instead of it just being very human? So we talked about all that now. So now we're getting down here to leadership, yes, and evaluation. So this is my new sexy evaluation discovery, which is just life-changing. So a question for you really is, actually, in all of this, do we have a problem with imagination? So why is it that we seem to have a gap in imagination? So I think we're better at commenting on and analysing the present. So back to my analysis paralysis of systems. God knows I have spent far too many hours doing that, and getting entrenched in that, actually, rather than designing the future. And if you look at newspaper columns, you read loads of research papers. So much of it is on analysing what's happening now rather than what's happening in the future. Our political parties still do it. Short-termism is still rife. I know we're getting better at it because we've got that wonderful piece of legislation that everybody's jealous of, but we still do need to rewards to happen quickly, and things still are, you know, I am still hearing, I've got to get this money out the door by March, will you spend it please? So that's still short-termist thinking, which creates an imagination gap. You're only going to draw on ideas that you've got lying around when you've got to do that. There's no room for new things. And social movements, are they better at arguing against something than they are about saying what the vision of the future might be? Does that feel too unrelatable if we're saying that stuff? Isn't it better to rant about what's wrong now? So we have drawn on what's lying around, I already said that, rather than making new things. Sorry. And everything's a remake. I'm dying to see this film, but you know, how are we only now having basic income, and only in Wales on very limited trial basis? So these aren't new ideas, they're really old ideas. So the point is that's taken ages for that to spread and thicken, so that there's just much less novel, fresher ideas around. So what do we do about that then? Well, do we spend enough time exploring our imaginations? Any of you who've been involved in any of the Future Gens work will have probably done a 3 Horizons exercise, and you will have explored the future. But how widespread is that kind of thinking? And is that happening at a grassroots level, where actually people are very connected to what the issues are, and so might have very different ideas about what the future is? And are we only in our echo chambers? I feel this a lot, that I might need to go to some really radically different forums and start reading radically different newspapers or something, because is it a thing that we're not diverse enough in who our audience is, and when we talk to each other about our ideas, that mean that we are just recycling the same things all the time? And or are we getting stuck in this everything's connected to everything again, and which disables our imagination? I want to just say something else. Never mind. So this is about leading and evaluating whilst the future is emerging. We don't know what the future is. It's about sitting with uncertainty. And being in uncertainty is difficult when we are very attached to the outcomes. So I would say this has been a real lesson for me, that my notions about myself and my success and my value have been very attached to the success or otherwise of the outcomes of what I'm working on. And there has been very little sort of compassion for myself or recognition, actually, that sitting with uncertainty and letting the future emerge, and me doing my best to be a part of helping that future emerge alongside others collectively, which is going to be messy and not linear and sometimes wrong, is a really difficult place to sit. Remembering that purpose is emergent, so it can't be created externally. We can't say this is definitely where we want to get to. It emerges from what's true in the collective. And I suppose I'm challenging us about who our collective is, and can we broaden that collective and bring in different people. And remembering this is deeply personal. I really think it is deeply personal. So how do we bring the personal into valuation? So, this to me is we did this at the ACES Hub, but we didn't do it with bells on. And now I'm at Nesta, and we're really thinking about how we are evaluating things in a very live and imaginative way. And I think it's about bringing evaluation in as a way of thinking to everybody. Now, my guess is you'll go, I've been doing this for ages anyway. You probably are doing this, but let's start formalising it then. Let's call it this. Let's not commission in an external evaluator to come in at the start and come in at the end and do some focus groups. When we, the people doing it, the people wanting and actively engaging with our communities, we just have it at our fingertips. We have it in our fibres. So we know. So bring us into it. Let us be part of the evaluation, and let that be legitimate. So how would this contribute? So I'm talking about, does this project work versus what works for who, in what ways, under what conditions, and with what results. So you might notice the U-turn from systems to this part is what we're going to look at because this is what we're doing. And actually my shift from the change doesn't have to be massive. You can have really powerful results in your area, and actually, co-production is teaching us this massively. Things that are happening ground up in alternative spaces to the system. Let's take that brain off and just create this alternative space over here. Let's evaluate it as we go from what we feel. Let's really bring our embodied selves into this, and that's where change happens. So you're planning something, you're doing something, and you're using it immediately. So you go back to that double loop learning. You're checking the assumptions behind things all the time, and you're sitting with the chaos that this involves. So critical thinking, creative thinking, inferential thinking, interpreting evidence, making sense of evidence comes into everybody's thinking. It's everybody's skill in the organisation. And then you are no longer needing leaders who are guardians of the values, because everybody becomes guardians of the values, or it's obvious that they're not, or you've got the wrong values. So this is what I think have a long-term enduring impact. It brings the work alive for everybody. It nurtures relationships. It helps us to see unanticipated consequences and side effects before waiting for the evaluation outcome that's written a report about something that you knew ages ago, but you need to wait for it to come out before you can change it. You change as you go. So you're not waiting for the findings as the primary outcome. We're no longer so attached to our worth being tied to that, but we're using our findings in a really astute and creative way. So those are the ways. Feeling more, psychological safety, and being creative in the ways we use evaluation are the ways I think that we can together hold the mindsets and cultures that allow for transformation. That's the end. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. As ever, an absolutely fantastic presentation that I think speaks to a lot of the things that people are battling with at the moment. I wanted to ask you, actually, the pandemic, I think, has had a big impact on people's styles of leadership, because when you're in a crisis, sometimes the leaders of the organisation have to take more control and make decisions very quickly. And I guess as we're coming out of the main pandemic phase, it's really important that that power is not retained in one place within an organisation, isn't it? That you release back that power and that decision making to other people within the organisation.
Yeah, totally. And this research was really interesting during the pandemic. I'm sure you've seen it. That so it was the organisations that were able to be really agile, both with their leadership styles and their service provision, that were the most successful. And it was those where the leaderships sort of hung on to too much power, if you like, in a too much command and control way, that didn't release the innovation from the ground. That meant that staff didn't perform really well because they and it affected, back to my point about so much of our worth being attached to our outcomes. So well, if you're not feeling like you're contributing anything because your leader's not recognizing it, then you're not feeling very well at work, and then you're not performing very well, you're not thriving, you're certainly not contributing any innovation. But the other thing was about people, you're absolutely right, needing that sense of safety, of knowing that my manager's got my back, whatever my decision is going to be. So it's a really tricky balance for leaders to be both of those things at the same time. But people managed it really well. And the other thing, though, this is anecdotal, I don't have the research for this, but this shift out now, so the need for that dispersed leadership model to come back to be the norm, and actually people's resistance to that, people that actually got used to not making all of the big responsible decisions and not wanting that to be dispersed anymore. So I think that just comes back to building back the right culture, because that's about people feeling safe enough to do that, or that courage, the bit about courage, that the courage to hold people well, so it's okay for them to fail. It's really tough, but yeah. So it's all about connecting, isn't it? And if you've got the forums for connection, then I think that can happen.
Definitely. And please do submit questions in the Q&A panel. I'll be keeping an eye on those. We've got a few in already, so I'll pose those to Charlotte. So at Pobl, so we're going back a few years now, but I remember you introducing and embedding that trauma-informed approach before the path training, before everyone was talking about it. And it'd be really interesting, your reflections on how pleased you are about how much this has been embedded and taken on. And we've still got lots to do, but the narrative has changed dramatically, hasn't it, since you set out to embed that approach in Pobl's young people services?
Yeah, it's just amazing now to, I think I was telling you, I was at a We Co-Produce conference yesterday, and it came up as one of the examples of things that have really shifted, is the understanding that there's a much more sort of layperson understanding of trauma and the impact of trauma and what being trauma informed means. And now we're into debates about, well, is it or isn't it, and when is it and when isn't it, and in what ways can it be trauma informed then but it isn't then. And that's just brilliant. So it's no longer kind of a blunt instrument we're going around banging the drum about. It's becoming really nuanced and sophisticated and applied in different ways, and we're learning the limitations of it in certain contexts. But also the absolute joy for me, as you know, is I've always felt really passionately that people in this sector do the work of people previously thought as specialist, and that we needed to refer people for some kind of specialist help. I'm not saying that doesn't benefit lots of people, but the therapeutic contribution that this sector makes in terms of helping people heal from trauma, just from its very existence and how they operate, is, that's prevention in action, isn't it? And healing in action in a systemic way that's quite revolutionary. So yeah, I feel really proud to be Welsh.
Definitely. And as you were kind of reflecting in your presentation, things like this aren't new. The concepts, the conversations around them have been with us for decades. And, yet still sometimes, and not so much these days, but certainly not that many years ago, we were having battles with government officials about whether this was a passing fad or whether it was something meaningful. And I think, it's widely accepted now that it is. And it's pleasing to have got there. But I think the other thing that I don't know whether you share my view on this is really positive to see organisations in our sector trying things and being able to be really honest about this was hard. But we're giving it a go, and this is working, and this we're finding a bit more challenging, but being quite open about that. And how important is that for the shared learning around this issue?
I mean, that's everything, Katie. That it's, I know it's great to celebrate success, but what's success? I mean, I think it's almost better when it's really, you learn so much more. I sound like a parent because I am one. There's one of the speeches for my kids about, you learn so much more when you fail than you do when it's all great. And as a manager, I never like doing that. Of course, I want my team to always be brilliant and be the best and be at a Commonwealth conference telling everyone how brilliant we are. But actually, you get much more from like, oh my God, this is really hard. And just getting the balance right between, I suppose, particularly those who, I mean, it's all on the spectrum, isn't it? So you can be out in the community doing floating support, and you can be encountering people with trauma on the 5 visits you do that day. So you're working in the community, healing it in that way, and not underestimating the power of those connections that you're creating and the impact that'll have on people's lives, right through to you can be in, a supported accommodation environment with a number of very challenging people who are struggling hugely. And so the work that you're doing there. So if you didn't encounter challenges and have brilliant learning and stories for us, and not just our sector, for many other sectors to learn, because I think the bravery of this sector, often schools' comprehensive system doesn't always allow for diversity of experience to be enacted in a classroom setting with a number of kids, whereas our sector doesn't have that luxury. And so there's lots of lessons that are transferable and inspiring for other sectors, and that's just an example.
And I know at the moment, I think, it's fair to say, and we've certainly had a session on it this morning, that thinking about how we get back to feeling that psychological safety is, I think, particularly challenging at the moment. We've got a workforce that has been under huge pressure over the last couple of years in terms of, start of the pandemic, anxiety about what COVID was, how much risk they were going to be putting themselves and their families at while continuing to develop services, to, the fact that we've still got 7,500 people in temporary accommodation and not enough permanent homes to get people into. And then, the transformation of homelessness services that we all want to see. But that burden of all of those things piled on top of each other has a huge impact, doesn't it, on, staff working, at the coalface, but also, I guess, managers and leaders trying to work out how to motivate people.
On everyone. And that's what honestly, that's what I've come to. I think I started there, but definitely the work now is for the people. It's for all people, but it's certainly in all organisations, whatever level you're doing that work at. If we can't create the right conditions for those people to thrive, and whether that's at making, top policy decisions, or whether it's at the coalface, as you say, wherever it is, if we can't create those right conditions and actually value and prioritise them. So this is my new rant, because it is like, I don't care if you've heard it before, we're not doing it, or we're not doing it well enough. We're not prioritising it enough. This isn't an away day or bringing in, a nice course about it. This is the fabric of our organisations needing to be like this. And I know Welsh Government are doing great things. I've seen some of their work around staff wellbeing. And so, but it's more than staff wellbeing. It's a kind of not add-on staff wellbeing to how you do your job. It's this is how we should do our jobs. I don't think we pay enough attention to embodying how ourselves at work and understanding how we're feeling about things actually has an impact on the decisions that team will make today, how successful our team will be today, and how successful our work will be. So particularly now, when that's that analysis paralysis stuff, when you feel overwhelmed by how are we going to solve this absolutely giant issue now, you can end up in the weeds, and I've been there so many times, of like, well, oh, we just need an away day to look at all of this, and you come out with really no further forward than you were before, because you feel paralyzed by the enormity of the situation. So I have shifted from that now to a belief in creating these alternative spaces, and you can only create those alternative spaces when they come from very personal places that create a different purpose. So then you create a different system with a different purpose, and you can go and do your thing in a way that is like, as Margaret Wheatley, Meg Wheatley talks about this. So she moved from a place where she believed that we all had to be connected, everything's connected, and we all need to get off our islands and all of this. And now she talks about you need to get back on your island, because just get back on your island and thrive as an island, because it's then that people will come to you rather than you trying to impact. I'm not saying don't ever think about systems, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying we can spend too much time thinking about systems. I'm going off on one, sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine, and that's one of the joys of having you to speak, is we kind of go on so many kind of tangents on various interlinked issues. In terms of let's finish on a positive note. So what is it that gives you hope and optimism for the future in terms of all of this stuff that we're talking about? We're talking about huge challenges, really difficult decisions, really challenging kind of services, and trying to meet the needs of people who've experienced significant trauma, and it's not going to be easy, but what is it that kind of gives you that hope and optimism that we can move in the right direction and have that impact?
So hope is a very interesting word that I've been thinking about lots about recently. So I never used to like the word hope because of that quote that I agreed with, that it doesn't involve any agency. So as if hope is something external that you can't. But I now believe that hope is something very human, and without hope, it's all bleak. And as humans, we all hope. So we all hope for better. So I think what gives me hope is it's the same thing. Sorry, Katie, but it's about tapping into my own personal purpose, because I know there are so many people like me, because I know them and love them and meet them all the time in this work. There are so many people who are here because they're driven by their purpose to want to be here and do good things, and that this shift from the understanding of the system is broken, and we, the poor people, as if they're not connected, whereas stepping into our power as people with a purpose who are agents in that system is what gives me hope.
Brilliant. And I think that's a fantastic message to be finishing off our conference with. We all have agency, and we might not be able to change the whole world, but we can certainly work at what we can change. And I think if we take forward the sort of values that we've been talking about over the last 3 days, we can make some positive change happen together. So thank you, Charlotte. And people are welcome to contact you, aren't they? Whether it be in your role as Nesta, or if there's other work outside of that for conversations.
Thanks for having me, Katie. Thanks so much.
Brilliant.
Thank
you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you.
So before we wrap up, I just want to reflect on some of the conversations that we've been having over the past 3 days. I hope you've all enjoyed the conference and found it interesting and engaging. On day one, we talked about rapid rehousing and heard from Marion Gibbs from the Scottish Government about the progress towards rapid rehousing in Scotland, and also heard about some of the really good case studies and practice from up there that hopefully we can learn from in Wales. We also talked about that thorny issue of getting rid of priority need, and actually some really positive thoughts about taking strides forward and making that happen. And we had a really good conversation about the future role of supported accommodation, and we will be taking forward those conversations with our members over the coming weeks, months and years as we look to what that might look like in the future. Yesterday, we heard from Jo Hopkins from the ACE Support Hub about the trauma-informed and compassionate work that's happening across Wales in different sectors and how we connect those dots. We heard about the new National Lottery Community Fund funded projects that are going to help end homelessness across Wales. Cannot wait to find out how those are doing and invite those back in years to come. And then we had a really important session about the nation of sanctuary and about how we can all play our part in supporting refugees and asylum seekers, whether that be as individuals or within our organisations, and heard some fantastic stories about the positive impact that organisations have had housing and welcoming refugees and asylum seekers in Wales. Today, we've had a really important update and conversation about how we can support our workforce, how we can value them and reward them and recognise them for their amazing, amazing work. And hopefully it gives you some assurance that there is work going on as part of the Welsh Government's Task and Finish group to make a real impact on that. We had a fascinating presentation from the Museum of Homelessness. Really fantastic to hear about the amazing work that they're doing within communities and as activists. And then finally, we've had a really reflective last session with Charlotte Waite, thinking about public service innovation, about psychological safety, culture and mindset. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our conference sponsor, Platfform. Without you, we wouldn't have been able to make the last 3 days happen. So thank you so much for your support. I'd like to thank all of our brilliant speakers who've shared their time, their expertise and their experiences with us over the last 3 days. They've been absolutely fantastic and I'm incredibly grateful to them. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I hope you've had a fantastic time. I hope you've learnt lots and it's given you lots of food for thought. I'd also like to thank the Cymorth team. So you see my face at the front of these conferences, but there's a bunch of people doing brilliant things behind the scenes. Particularly like to give a massive shout out to Wilf, who is our new events officer. This is their first conference and they've done an absolutely fantastic job of making it run smoothly. So thank you very much indeed, Wilf. We'll be in touch with feedback forms. Please do fill them out because it helps us to make these conferences better for you in the future. And we'll also be providing you with links to access recordings of these sessions. So if you missed any, you're able to catch up on them. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much for being part of our annual conference this year. And we hope to see you all again very, very soon. Thank you.